Okay, let's do it. Um, so today I'm going to talk a little bit more about the course that I am going to be teaching with IPAC EDU. So if you're hearing this for the first time, let me explain what IPAC EDU is quickly. So IPAC EDU stands for the Institute for Pure and Applied Knowledge, and then EDU is just, education. So IPAC EDU is a science research organization that has kind of an education arm as part of it that is called IPAC EDU. And this was all started by Dr. James Lyons Weiler a couple of years ago. And he and I came into contact a couple of months ago and started talking about this online community that he had formed, IPAC EDU, a couple of years ago, and that has grown over the last couple of years. And now this online university offers about 30 courses, in excess of 30 courses that people can go and can sign up for. If they're interested in just continuing their education for a topic that interests them, that is offered at IPAC EDU. So when Dr. James Lyons Weiler, as he's often known, Dr. Jack, so he and I, through a mutual contact, started talking a couple of months ago. And one of the things that we started talking about was, well, hey, how can we maybe take IPAC EDU and continue to expand it? So maybe expand the type of courses that are offered so that so the courses there that are offered, many of them are scientific in nature, which is great, of course, very necessary. But perhaps there's a way to expand the type of course into other humanities type courses, etc. So we started speaking about this, and in fact, Dr. Jack even conducted a survey to try and figure out, well, what would resonate with potential students? What would they like to learn about? What new types of courses? And so he and I had talked about a course that has become the course that I'm going to be teaching. And the original idea was a course in dystopian literature and taking insights from dystopian literature and then looking at kind of what we're going through in the world today and seeing if that literature is helpful almost as an interpretive lens to better understand, this crazy world that we all find ourselves in now. So when that idea was pitched along with other ideas as part of this survey, that one seemed to resonate with potential students. So I built a curriculum for it, and here we are. So the course is called Literature as Resistance, and the subtitle is Recognizing, Unmasking, and Countering Totalitarian Tendencies. So that's kind of a mouthful. So what does that mean? Well, it means, again, let's take some of these texts that were written in the past, and in some cases, quite a while ago, and let's read through them and then see if there are warnings or insights that we can take from them that will help us understand maybe how we can counter some of the either governmental overreach or some of the encroachment upon our liberties that we are certainly experiencing today, and that if we're not careful, could get worse. So so what I want to do today is I kind of want to explain a little bit more about the course. I've done this in other interviews, but I'm going to explain a little bit more about it. I'm going to explain the text that we're going to use in the course, and then I'm also going to explain why I chose these works and why I excluded others. Obviously, when you pick certain things you're gonna study as part of a course, that means you're choosing those at the exclusion of others. So why were plenty of other great and relevant works excluded? I'll kind of explain what my thought process was in choosing these 6. You can see I got my glasses on because we're gonna talk about smart stuff tonight a bit. So if you can't be smart, at least look smart, right? So so I actually got this pair. I've had glasses for about 20 years. I don't own any contacts. I'm either wearing my glasses or I'm not wearing anything. So I wear my glasses when I read, when I work on the computer. But other than that, I just take them off, and I pretty much operate fine. I got these not quite a year ago. Towards the end of 2022, I was already out of the Army. So I went to my dog. You can blame him. He ruined my other pair of glasses because I was out on the deck with him. And then I went inside and I set my glasses on like the railing of the deck. And I went inside, and in the meantime, he grabbed them and carried them out in the yard. So anyway, so I go out there, I got to find him in the yard. I found him, and that's all he had done. All he had done was grab them and carry them into the yard and drop them. But just in carrying them, he had scratched them up. Okay, cool. So, I had to go get new glasses. So when I pick out these frames, right? So the lady's there, and, you got to get them fitted to your head or whatever. And she asks me, "Hey, what do you do for work?" And I was unprepared for the question because I'd just gotten out of the Army, and I was kind of surveying the landscape as to what I wanted to do next. And I was doing a lot of writing because I had this idea where I want to write a book about my experiences and kind of, my Army career and the way it ended, et cetera, et cetera. And I have a lot of kind of a very, very rough draft written, and I was writing heavily on it at that time. And so I told her, so I didn't know what else to say, right? I mean, I just got out of the Army after 19 years, trying to figure out exactly where I want to go next. I'm writing a lot. So I said, I'm a writer, which is not a lie because I was writing a lot at the time. And I do kind of have this idea, this book. Ideally, at some point I'll finish it, soon-ish and get that thing out. But she says to me, "Oh, those glasses really make you look like a writer." So, which I was appreciative of. I liked that comment because I was like, well, even if I'm just a wannabe writer, at least I look the part, right? So anyway, so that's good. If you can't be smart, look smart. If you're just kind of a pretend wannabe writer, at least look like one. That's a great starting point. And writing is important, and so is reading. So today we're going to talk about reading, and we're going to talk about this course, and we're going to talk about the way the course is laid out and why I chose the text that we're going to use. So the course starts on September 7th, which is in, just over a week. And it's going to be taught on Thursday nights. Each lesson will be about 90 minutes, give or take. And it's 19 lessons. So one lesson a week. And what we're going to do is for the first couple of lessons, we are going to define some terms and kind of remind ourselves about how to read literature. So if you're a person who, you're not a big reader, or it's been a while since you've read, you do not have to be intimidated. Like, no problem. Like, come and join the course anyway. And this would be a great opportunity to maybe hold yourself accountable, with some other people in a friendly sort of way, and encourage yourself to read, whereas otherwise, you might not. So when we start, the first couple of lessons, we're going to define some terms, lay out what the course looks like. And we'll also go over just a couple of maybe some strategies for how to read for those who maybe will, come in and freely admit, "Hey, I'm looking forward to reading these, but I have not read in a while." Cool, no problem. You do not have to be intimidated by a course that has some reading in it. There are no tests. Nobody's going to make anybody look foolish. We're all here to learn. We're all here to learn from each other. And here's the deal. If you choose to come and participate in the course and you choose to do none of the reading, like literally zero of the reading, all good. You are still welcome. And my hope is that you will still learn a lot from the course. And I think you will. Now, would you learn a lot more if you did some of the reading or all of the reading? Absolutely. But I still think that even if you came in and you said, "Happy to be here, happy to learn about these books, not interested in reading any of them at all," no problem. You will still take a lot from the course. And I say that confidently, right? But Also, I encourage you to at least do some of the reading. You know what? And if you read some of the books and you don't read all of them, or if you only read 2/3 of this book and 3/4 of the other one and half of another one, hey, you know what? That's better than not reading any of them. You will still come away with a much better appreciation of these texts. But like I said, even if you choose to read nothing, um, you are still completely welcome in the course. Happy to have you. And I still think you're going to learn a lot. And hopefully we'll have a lot of fun. So, in the first couple of lessons, when we kind of lay out what the curriculum of the course is going to look like, and we define some terms, well, what are we gonna define? Well, I said that the title of the course was Literature as Resistance, and then the subtitle was Recognizing, Unmasking, and Countering Totalitarian Tendencies. That title would lead us to believe that there's an objective behind this course. This is not just, a book club for nerds. I mean, it may be that, but it's going to be more than that. We're going to talk about this stuff with a purpose, and that purpose is better understanding the world in which we live in today. So we may be reading some old texts, but again, we're not reading those old texts to better understand the world 100 years ago when that text was written. We're reading those texts, in some cases from 100 years ago, to better understand today. So the books that we're going to read are a vehicle for us to get smarter about how to keep ourselves free and how to recognize some of these totalitarian tendencies, either before they happen or as they're happening. Why? So that we can kind of give ourselves some decision space to get out ahead of this stuff, maybe maneuver ourselves into a much better position, or help other people understand what's happening, so that we give ourselves more of an opportunity to resist, or a better chance at resisting to a greater degree. So with that said, some of the terms that we're going to define, well, we need to define what totalitarian or totalitarianism means. Now, most people are very familiar with that term. We're reading dystopian works. So what's a dystopia? Now, most people are familiar with the term utopia. Dystopia is the opposite, so we can talk about that. Then is dystopian the same thing as totalitarian? Or is it similar, but maybe not an exact synonym? We're going to kind of talk through that. If there are differences, or if those words aren't exactly the same, what's the difference, and why are these works called dystopian works? We're going to talk through that. There's a term that a lot of people have gotten familiar with the last couple of years is technocracy. So what's a technocracy? And if you hear someone refer to a technocratic regime, well, what does that mean? Or another term that, I'll be honest, I had not heard before the last couple of years is scientific dictatorship. Well, what's a scientific dictatorship? And, one thing that we've all heard the last couple of years is, well, what does science have to do with everything that's going on? Or some people have even heard the term scientism. Well, what's scientism compared to science? Or if you hear somebody say, hey, they want us to, bow down and worship at the altar of science. Well, what does that mean? Or if somebody says, science has almost become a religion for the government. What does that mean when people say that? So let's talk through all of that so we can kind of understand some of these terms that we're going to be using for the duration of the 19 lessons. So we'll define all those terms, make sure that we all have a common language as we move forward through the curriculum. Okay, then we're going to read. So what's the first thing that we're going to read? The first work that we're going to read is called The Machine Stops. The author is E.M. Forster. Now, in terms of publication dates, this is actually the oldest work that we're going to read. It has the earliest publication date, and the publication date is actually 1909. So you're talking about a little short story that is almost 115 years old. So why are we going to read this, and why are we reading it first? Well, there's a couple reasons. And it's not because it's the earliest publication date. We're not reading these in some sort of chronological order by publication date, because the publication date in relation to the other works and their publication dates doesn't really matter. Now, it is interesting when you look how old some of these are, and yet how prescient their insights may be. Yeah, that's quite interesting. But in terms of reading this one because it was published before this one, etc., we don't necessarily need to do that. We're not going to worry so much about that, because many of these, the setting for the story of the narrative may take place in some sort of future, or in some cases with some of these, it takes place in a future in which the year is unnamed, because within the story, kind of the calendar system, the convention for naming their years according to their new calendar system is, completely different. So we don't necessarily need to read them in order of publication date. So this one is the earliest. That's not why we're reading it first. We're reading it first because I think it's a good starting point for students who might be unfamiliar with dystopian literature. For one reason, it's very short. So it's only about 40 pages. It's super thin. So if you haven't read in a while, this narrative is not extremely complex. That does not mean that it's not a great story. It doesn't mean that we can't take a lot from it. On the contrary, but it's the narrative is not overly complex. It's fairly easy to read, and yet we will take a lot from it. We'll be able to analyze quite a bit from it. Now, the astute observer may look at this, and from the title alone, The Machine Stops, may say, well, if I had to guess, that story probably has to do with some sort of like supreme mechanization of society. And that would be true. Okay. And I'm not going to give away the plot here, so I'm not going to explain much more than that. But the title, many people would probably take that from the title, where there's some grand machine which controls many of the functions of society. So when we read through the text, we can see, okay, well, when that happens, what does that mean for the people that live in this society? What does that mean for the relationships that they have with each other? What does that mean for their relationship with the machine? What happens then to their belief system? Their, what we might call religion, with having this machine that controls everything in society. What about the way in which they think, the way in which they come up with ideas, the way in which they think about the future? There are a lot of ways in which we can analyze this text, even though it's so old. Now, it's interesting because if we think about, well, who talks about mechanizing society today when we think about, the concept of the planned city? Or we think about maybe mechanization, but maybe with a little bit more of a digital flavor. More maybe more digitized than the author here, E.M. Forster, may have thought in 1909. But if we think about a grand machine that could control everything, we might think, that's not super far-fetched if you think about it in terms of, AI potentially, right? So in that case, those are some things that, AI is not necessarily talked about in this book, but it's not hard for us to take a story from 1909, take many of the concepts, kind of update them in our mind a bit, and see how the themes absolutely remain relevant even in 2023. So that is The Machine Stops. That's the first thing we're going to read. 40-page short story. Okay, short, easy to read, and a great lead-in for kind of the Big Daddy. So 1984. So 1984 is the work of dystopian fiction. Now, does that mean that it is the one that is the most accurate in depicting where we've gone since the book was written? I don't know. I'm not necessarily saying that. A lot of people would say that may not necessarily be the case, but it is the big daddy in terms of dystopian fiction. When you say dystopian fiction, for a lot of people, if there's one book that comes to mind, it is 1984, George Orwell. And George Orwell's name has almost become synonymous with dystopia, or a dystopian regime, or like a dystopian form of totalitarianism, or nowadays, technocracy, etc. Now, George Orwell is actually not his real name. That's his pen name. His real name is Eric Blair. He was born in British India, right around the turn of the century. I think he was born in 1903, George Orwell. But a lot of literature professors in literature classes, not everybody, but some of them will say, hey, when you're gonna read a book, don't focus too much on the author's background or the biography of the author, because you don't want that to overly color your perception of the text. The text has got to stand on its own. I understand why they do that, but we are going to at least look into the biography of these authors, because I do think it's important. Because one of the questions that we're going to wrestle with throughout the curriculum is, are these individuals, and it may be different for different authors, are these individuals trying to warn us? Are they telling us this and it's a foregone conclusion and there's nothing that we can do about it? So are they giving us hope? Are they telling us there is no hope? Are they trying to warn humanity? Are they part of insider groups who are going to be perpetrating this against us? We're going to talk about the author's motivations in as much as we can, deduce those, and we'll do what we can. But in some cases with some of these, it will be clearer than others as to what the motivations of the authors at least might have been. So 1984. So this was published in 1949. Now, George Orwell is known for two major novels. The first was Animal Farm, which was written in 1945. The second is 1984, written in 1949. We're not going to read Animal Farm. Animal Farm is a great book. I completely recommend it. By all means, read it. We're just, we can't read everything. There's kind of a meme that has been out there the last couple of years, right? Make Orwell fiction again. Well, why is that even a meme? What's the driving idea behind that meme? Make Orwell fiction again. So if you've heard that, and so let's say you've never read this book, but you understand kind of the cultural milieu in which George Orwell's name, rings a bell with people, and they think of, totalitarianism, or you hear the term Big Brother. Like, people understand that Big Brother means like government, massive, government oversight. People, they know that term. Well, I mean, that comes from 1984, right? Thought crime. So even if you've never read the book, but you're familiar with the term thought crime, I mean, that comes from 1984. So if you haven't read the book, but you're kind of passingly familiar with some of these themes, well, I mean, let's read the book. Let's figure out why this stuff has become so culturally important, since it was written back in 1949. Okay, so again, this is the big daddy when it comes to dystopian fiction. You got to read 1984. Okay. If 1984 is the most well-known kind of in the West for dystopian literature, this next book is probably the second most well-known, and that is Brave New World. Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. Now, this was published earlier than 1984. It was published in 1932, and Aldous Huxley is about a decade older than George Orwell. And in fact, at one point, he was actually his French teacher. Aldous Huxley was George Orwell's French teacher. Aldous Huxley had some interesting commentary, which we may look at, on 1984 after it was written. So Aldous Huxley, about a decade older than George Orwell, Aldous Huxley writes his book in 1932 is when it's published, compared to 1984, which is published in 1949. So Aldous Huxley's vision of the future that he posits in this book is in some ways different than the one that George Orwell envisions in his posited world, you know? So we're going to look at that. What are those two visions? Obviously, they certainly have a lot of similarities, but what are the differences? Because a lot of people nowadays, and you may even hear people kind of make this distinction, a lot of people will say, hey, this aspect of what we're living in right now is more like Brave New World than 1984. Or maybe other people debate that and they say, no, it's actually more like 1984. Well, in order to even be able to appreciate that debate or that discussion, we got to understand, well, what's Orwell's vision is kind of laid out in 1984. And then what's Aldous Huxley's vision is kind of laid out in Brave New World. And also, when I say their vision, well, this is a question we need to answer as well. When Aldous Huxley writes Brave New World, is he saying, hey, this is what's going to happen in the future? This is kind of how it's going to be, or at least this is my best guess as to how it's going to be. Is that what he's saying, or is he just writing a story, or is he just saying, well, this is kind of how it could be, or what? We kind of need to know that. But in order for us to have an appreciation of dystopian fiction and their relevance for today, I would say if you could only read two books, read 1984 and read Brave New World, because together they kind of create a mosaic for how we could interpret the world in which we live. And we could look at it and we could say, hey, this is pretty Orwellian and this is more, Huxleyan. Because a lot of people use Orwellian as a cover term for anything that's dystopian or totalitarian, but some people might be using the term Orwellian, which obviously comes from George Orwell's name, to describe something that is much closer to an event or a condition that is described by Aldous Huxley in Brave New World. So people might actually be using the term Orwellian to describe something that is completely different than what Orwell wrote. So yeah, we're going to talk about all that. We're going to compare and contrast their two visions, and not those two. We're going to compare and contrast what the two of them wrote with E.M. Forster, who wrote The Machine Stops. After we write Brave New World, we're also going to have some essays that we're going to read. We're going to have some reflections that are going to take us back to look at some writings from Plato from the Republic. So obviously, Plato's Republic is more than 2,000 years old. But there are some, and we are not going to read the Republic, but there are some analyses or some references to Plato's Republic that may help us understand some of this dystopian fiction that we are going to read. So we are going to read some essays that kind of refer to Plato's Republic. We may look at some references from Plato's Republic, just like we'll also look at some quick references from other dystopian literature that we aren't actually going to read the full text of here, just because, again, we got to draw the fence somewhere about what we can read and what we can't read. Okay, after Brave New World, we're going to read this novel that not a lot of people have heard of. It's called We, just simply We, as in W-E, we, like you and me. Okay, The author is Yevgeny Zamyatin. So, why are we going to read We? There's a couple of reasons. One, not a lot of people in the West are familiar with We, which is a real shame. They kind of should be. So it's kind of one of those books that I wish more people were aware of. Another reason we're going to read it is because it's Russian. So the other things that we're going to read are from Western authors. So I just screwed up though. We're actually not going to read We next after we read Brave New World. So hold on, we're going to come back to We. We're going to read Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451 after Brave New World. We are going to read We, so you got a sneak peek as to what we're going to read after Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. So Fahrenheit 451, Ray Bradbury is he is an American author. Huxley is British, Orwell's British. Ray Bradbury is an American author. Of everything that we're going to look at, this is the one that was published the latest. So it was published in 1953. So a couple of years after 1984. So if you think about, so it's interesting when you think about when these works were published. And again, we're not reading them in chronological order of publication date, but it is interesting to look at when each was published. When you look at, The Machine Stops in 1909, I mean, World War I hasn't even happened yet. When you look at, Brave New World being published in 1932, you're kind of in the interwar period, in between World War I and World War II. George Orwell, his book is written a couple of years after the conclusion of World War II. Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, obviously World War II had been concluded a couple of years prior. This was published in 53. So basically as the Korean War was ending, so the armistice to stop the hostilities of the Korean War would have been in July of 1953. So right around when this is being published. So the title Fahrenheit 451, for those who may not necessarily be familiar with this book or this title, and I would say this one's not as well known as 1984 Brave New World, but there's still plenty of people who are aware of this book. But Fahrenheit 451, the title is a reference to the temperature at which paper burns, i.e., like book burning. So the kind of the central theme of this text is censorship by way of book burning. Now, there's much more that can be taken from this book than just that, but that's where the title comes from. So is that the actual temperature that paper burns at? We could quibble about that. There are people who dispute that, not important, but that is where the title came from, Fahrenheit 451. So with the censorship that we have faced the last couple of years, book burning, whether it be literally tossing books into a fire or deplatforming of certain organizations, or censoring individuals online, etc. I mean, it's all the same, right? So again, a very appropriate book for us to read right now. And I do like the title. Like I like the title Fahrenheit 451, and just it's kind of on the nose as to what it's in reference to, but I still do like the title. And in some ways, this might actually be my favorite of all the books that we're going to read. It's hard for me to pick one, but this one might be. I do like Fahrenheit 451. I didn't mention it, but for those who might not know where the title Brave New World comes from, Brave New World is actually taken from Shakespeare. That is taken from the play The Tempest. And Shakespeare is actually referenced in Brave New World. So that's kind of interesting. So we'll talk more about that when we get there. Okay, cool. I had my books piled up out of order, and then so I got kind of screwed up as I was telling you guys in what order we're going to read them. But we're going to read Fahrenheit 451 before we read We. So we're going to read We. This is going to be the last book we're going to read. The sixth work of quote unquote literature that we're going to look at is actually going to be a movie. So We is written by Yevgeny Zamyatin, a Russian author, and it was written very early. So it was written, typically the publication date is given as between about 1920 and 1921. So what's going on? So the Bolsheviks had taken over. The Russian Revolution is a very bloody ordeal. Obviously, I mean, we know about the history of the USSR. So when you look at what's going on in the very early 20s within Russia or within the Soviet Union, that's a very interesting time for a book like We to come out. Now, when this book is published, or when this book is written, right, it actually is not published in Russian until much, 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 much later. I think not till the 80s. So it's written in the early 20s, and then it's published a couple of years later, but it's published in Britain. I think it was Britain. It might have been the United States, but I think it was Britain. But the point is that it was published in the West because it could not be published inside the Soviet Union. And supposedly, this was actually the first book that was published by the Soviet bureau that was censoring books. So in that way, it's got kind of that mark of distinction. Now, a lot of people in the West are not super familiar with this book, but they should be. I'll tell you someone who was familiar with it, and that's George Orwell. So this book, published in the kind of the mid 1920s in English, well, that's 20 plus years before George Orwell wrote his book. And so it was known to have influenced George Orwell. Some people say it influenced Aldous Huxley before he wrote Brave New World. I think he disputes that. Whatever, we could talk about that. But the point is that this book did influence some Western authors who wrote dystopian fiction. Now, some people would tell you, others would dispute this, but some people would tell you that this is really like the first dystopian novel. Is that true? Is that not true? Whatever. People may have differences of opinion, but I mean, the book is 100 years old. And this book is very unique. So what I will tell you is, in this book, the protagonist doesn't even have a name. Everyone there. So in this book, everyone's identity has been reduced down to letters and numbers, right? And when you look at what type of government has taken over, what type of government is in power within this, this world that has been created by Yevgeny Zamyatin in this novel, well, the government is referred to as one state. So just think in your mind about this government superstructure that is called one state, and that nobody has a name, and that everyone is just known by a series of like letters and numbers. What that does to your identity, how that severs you from your connection to the past, your familial relationships with, like, your parents, your siblings, etc. So just think about what that would mean. But then also, it goes further. The government operates on along the principles of like mathematical optimization. So imagine a world in which, like, think about this in our terms. Imagine a world in which everything is ruled by algorithms that seek to optimize productivity or optimize efficiency, etc. So everything is reduced down to mathematical formulas. Well, think about what that does for emotional relationships, or think about what that does for uh, things that you enjoyment that you might seek that can't necessarily be quantified per se. Okay. Um, so think about an environment where every hour of your day is completely regimented, and there is a table of activities with the exact, allotted time in which you're going to execute, activity A, activity B, activity C, activity D, every single activity to include, the most intimate of activities. It's all kind of regimented by this table. So that's kind of the society that is imagined in Yevgeny Zamyatin's book, We. Now think about the title, We. So think about, again, the government is called one state. No one has a name. So just think about the what that does to the identity of an individual when your identity's basically been dissolved, and everyone almost becomes some sort of like mass or blob of people. And that is very much symbolized in the title, We. I mean, you can see the collectivist nature depicted in just the title. So this is a fascinating book. I mean, it's really a crazy read, and I mean that in like a really good way. But when you think about the obsession with mathematics, and then you think about what we've been dealing with the last couple of years in terms of like science, I mentioned the term scientific dictatorship, where you reduce humans down to just almost like an assembly of parts, and everything has to be quantified. We're going to talk about what that means. Okay. So that's We. If you've never heard of that before, then great. It'll be a good opportunity for you to read a fascinating piece of literature that's 100 years old. And when you read it, there are a lot of things in it that you're just going to be like, that is really crazy. But you know what? I might have thought that was totally unreasonable 3 years ago. And now I think that that's maybe not as unreasonable as I would have thought then. I think that's going to happen a lot as we read some of these books. So the sixth piece of literature, I guess I'm using that term quite loosely, that we're going to look at is actually a movie. So I'm going to hold up a book here, but we're going to watch the movie. So the movie is called Metropolis. Okay, so what is this then? This is like the novelized screenplay, which is fascinating. It really is fascinating. We are not going to read this. We just obviously don't have time. I'm kind of holding this up because I do have it and I do find it fascinating, but it at least gives me something for me to hold up as I mentioned Metropolis. So the author of this is Thea von Harbo, who at the time the movie came out was the wife of Fritz Lang. So the movie was done by Fritz Lang. The screenplay, which is kind of what this novelized version is here, was written by Thea von Harbo. So they're German. The movie was released in 1927. So you're talking about the early days of movies. So we're going to watch a movie that's almost 100 years old. Now, this movie is it's an incredible movie. It is a dystopian movie, very dystopian. It's also very eerie. It's a black and white movie, and it is also a silent film. So if you've never watched a silent film, you have to understand that you're kind of watching a filmed play. So the actors, they kind of overact the way that stage actors do, as opposed to like, film actors, because, when you're watching a film actor, the camera's very up close where you can see the expressions on their face, which means that the expressions that they use to to act are more natural. The way that people kind of really use facial expressions in the real world. On a play, when you may be seated kind of far back in the audience or whatever, and you're looking at people on a stage that are, a good ways away from you, they kind of have to overact in order for everyone in the audience to understand what they're actually conveying. So in a silent film, because you don't really have dialogue, the actors have to kind of sell what's going on in the movie. And so there's a lot of overacting. So you just kind of got to understand that when you're watching a silent film. I mean, it's a very unique genre. But it is a fascinating movie, extremely dystopian. And yeah, I mean, it's 100 years old. Came out in 1927. So German, like I said. So we've got a good mix of a movie from Germany, some British authors, an American author, and a Russian author. So we got a fairly good mix of the literature that we're gonna go through. Now, why did I pick these books? I tried to pick a good mix. I tried to pick some things that people are not familiar with. Like a lot of people probably are not familiar with the movie Metropolis. A lot of people are probably not familiar with this book, though they really should be. And a lot of people are probably not familiar with E.M. Forster's The Machine Stops, right? Fair enough. But a lot of people are familiar, even if it's just superficially or just kind of culturally, with 1984 and with, Brave New World. And then quite a few people have at least heard of, and a lot of people have read, Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. So I really wanted to read those three, but I wanted to mix in these others as well. It's going to be a robust course, which is why it's 19 lessons, because it's going to take us a couple of lessons to get through each of these. But there are plenty of things that we're not going to read. So I wanted to read texts that were older because I wanted us to look at some of the timelessness of some of these themes. So when you read something from E.M. Forster's The Machine Stops and you tell yourself, man, this was written almost 115 years ago, but so much of it is so relevant. That's incredible to me. Like that's, or when you watch Metropolis and you're like, man, this movie's 96 years old, but some of this stuff is applicable to like right now. I find that fascinating. That's why I did not want to read something like, people would ask me, well, what about The Hunger Games? Yeah, that is dystopian fiction, but everyone's already familiar with that. And most everybody, a lot of people have already read the books. I haven't, I have not. But a lot of people have already seen the movies. So let's look at something that's a little bit more classic, like a little bit older, kind of recognized as part of the, like Brave New World, 1984, and Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, and even those are kind of considered to be part of the canon, if you will, of dystopian literature. Nothing wrong with The Hunger Games, but everyone's already familiar with it. So let's go back to some of the older, more classic stuff. Like I said, Fahrenheit 451 is the most recently published work that we're going to look at, and it's 70 years old. Other people said, what about The Handmaid's Tale? Nothing wrong with The Handmaid's Tale. And, a lot of people are familiar with the TV show now. But again, let's look at the stuff that is a little bit older. Yeah, at the exclusion of some things that more people are already much more familiar with. And if you read these books, it may help you understand the TV series, The Handmaid's Tale, or the novel better. Or it may help you understand, The Hunger Games better. Somebody asked me, actually more than one person, Solzhenitsyn. So, Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago. Well, there's a couple reasons why we can't read that. I'm a huge Solzhenitsyn fan. The Gulag Archipelago is a trilogy, very complex, very dense, and would be great for a course, but it would have to be a course would probably have to be dedicated solely to that, or at least solely to Solzhenitsyn. There's no way that we could read that and read these other works. The other reason why I did not want to read Solzhenitsyn, and I'm a huge Solzhenitsyn fan, is that I wanted to read works of fiction. Okay, so maybe people aren't familiar with Solzhenitsyn. So Alexander Solzhenitsyn is even if you're not familiar with him, he is fairly well known. He was a dissident from the Soviet Union. I can't remember exactly when he was born, but he was a captain in the Red Army during World War II. So he's a captain in the Red Army. He grew up in an Orthodox Christian family. And then later, I think as an army officer, he kind of renounces religion, like most people in the Soviet Union, right? Adopts Marxism and atheism, like most of his peers, the majority of his peers. But then later writes a letter in which he criticizes Stalin, goes to the Gulag for 8 or 9 years. Somewhere along the way, he also battles cancer. But anyway, long story short, he gets out of the Gulag. He later writes about his stories. He kind of re-encounters Christianity. And I mean, he has a fascinating story. And he died. I can't remember exactly when he died, but he died. I mean, he lived to be a pretty good age. I mean, he met with Putin. I want to say he died around 2010. I might be wrong on that, but so he outlived the Soviet Union, and he was a very, very heavily known critic. He would travel in the West, and he would criticize the Soviet Union, but he also started criticizing the West, because he would criticize the West, and he would say, hey, this postmodernism that is kind of running rampant in the West, you guys are kind of following the same path that the Soviet Union followed. So Solzhenitsyn is a fascinating guy. He wrote this trilogy of books called The Gulag Archipelago, as someone who spent 8 or 9 years in the Gulag. Fascinating, kind of a hard read. And when I say a hard read, I mean like psychologically hard. Fascinating, but not exactly within the scope of what we're doing in this course. So that's a great work to read, a great series to read, to understand totalitarianism from an actually totalitarian society, the Soviet Union. Whereas we are looking at fictitious depictions of totalitarianism. Now, why would we do that? Why would we look at made up fictitious totalitarian or dystopian regimes when we can look at stories written about real regimes? Yeah, I got it. I'm not saying one is better than the other. I'm just saying that in this course, we're going to read works of fiction. And here's why. By all means, go read Solzhenitsyn. By all means. Huge Solzhenitsyn fan. But read these works of fiction too, because in a work of fiction, the author has much more latitude to be able to communicate things in fiction than in nonfiction, where you're constrained by this thing called the truth, right? So there's utility in both. But when these guys are writing, when Aldous Huxley is writing, he is writing and trying to give insights about a world that he's kind of creating. So let's talk about world building for a moment. So what's world building? Well, these guys a lot of times are creating a world in a year that has a completely different numbering convention. And therefore, for us, it's almost like hard to understand, is this 100 years in the future from when it was written, or is this 500 years or whatever? And that's deliberate, right? But it adds to the timelessness of some of the themes. Now, not all of them are like that, but some of them are, where the they give you the year, and it kind of makes no sense. It's like a series of letters or whatever, and you're like, I don't even know what that numbering convention is on a calendar related to 2023. I don't know how far into the future that would be. And like I said, that's deliberate. But world building. So think about an extreme example of world building. That would be like J.R.R. Tolkien's Legendarium, where you have all the stories in this this mythical like cosmology that he creates, Middle Earth and all the associated realms, etc. So that would be like world building writ large. These guys don't go quite that far, but when you're envisioning a futuristic society in a futuristic scenario with kind of like an undetermined year, and the idea of a relation between that world and the world that we know is kind of hard to exactly decipher. You are engaged in world building because you're positing a world that is not exactly the world that we live in, and that's important. I think that creativity is important for us to understand. And so there's some utility in reading these works of fiction because you are able to read an author who is unconstrained by the world that we live in. Now, the question that somebody could ask me is, yeah, but if somebody's just creating like this world out there that may or may not have relation to our real world, then how can we read it and decide that it has anything that is useful or of value for us to analyze in order to better understand our world? And I would say, I think there's a ton that we can take from it, but there's a ton that we can take from it because the author, and we'll see as we read. And I think those who have never read these books that go through the course and read will come away. I'm assuming, but I don't want to. Everyone can draw their own conclusions for sure, but my assumption is that people will conclude that yes, these authors were quite prescient in their ability to foresee a lot of the stuff that we're going through right now. But that prescience is powerful because they're using fiction to do it. So they're kind of having to foresee, they're having to kind of, predict what's going to be there, as opposed to writing about something in the real world that is really happening. So that was a very long-winded, meandering way of me explaining why we're not going to read Solzhenitsyn. There's absolutely nothing wrong with the Gulag Archipelago other than it's psychologically intense, and everyone should read it. I haven't read through the entire Gulag Archipelago, but I should. I mean, I said it to myself. I should too. Should read through the whole thing. But we're going to focus on these works of fiction. So yeah, you got to figure out what you're going to read. Some things you're not going to be able to read. We can't read everything. I want to focus on fiction. I wanted to focus on some works that people were familiar with or should be more familiar with, and then others that maybe people had not heard of, but would be great for them to get to understand. So my aim for the course is I want people to feel encouraged to read more. I think we all need to read more. And this will be a great way, in a friendly, non-judgmental environment, no tests, where people can read as much or as little as they want, but hopefully everyone will use this as a great opportunity to read more of these books than they might otherwise have ever done. Because I'm assuming some people are hearing about some of these books for the first time. That's great. Good. The other thing is, I want us all on the backside of these 19 lessons to potentially have a better understanding of where we are through using these as an interpretive lens. And I want people, what I want as we progress through the course, what I want people, when we're reading after having read these other books, I want people to say, Zamyatin, the author of is positing a world that to some degree looks in this regard like what Forster imagined in The Machine Stops. But, Zamyatin says this, whereas, Huxley said this. That's kind of the way I want us to talk about these books, but then also to talk about like what's going on right now. So a lot of the discussion that we have in class will be, hey, what's going on right now in 2023? And what aspects of what we see right now are Orwellian, or what makes us think of Brave New World, or what makes us think of a scene that we saw in the movie Metropolis. So that's kind of, I want us to have a better appreciation of the world that we live in through reading these texts. Okay, good. So that was very long-winded. That's the way I do things. Why say in 30 words what you can say in 100 words? So I hope that maybe sheds a little bit more light on the text that we're going to read. Like I said, I've given a couple interviews and I've talked about this. I wanted to talk about it a little bit more. I wanted to talk about it maybe where I wasn't constrained by time, and then where I could go through and answer some of the questions that I've gotten recently about, hey, why not read about this? And every suggestion that I've gotten has been a really good suggestion. Solzhenitsyn, fantastic suggestion, not quite within the parameters of what we're trying to do here. Handmaid's Tale, I have read that novel. I don't know if many dudes have read that novel. So, but anyway, but I have. I read it like 20 years ago. And speaking of 20 years ago, that's when I first read 1984. I read Animal Farm in 1984, like 20 years ago. And I understood the story. I mean, I understood 1984's like superficial plot. I understood the narrative of the story. And I was like, oh, this is about totalitarianism. I did not read those in college, but I read them on my own right after I graduated college. I read Animal Farm, and then I read 1984. That's probably like 23. And I did, but I will tell you, I did not understand them to any degree that approximates the understanding that I have now. And I'm not telling you that I'm, super literature professor now, but just 20 extra years of life experience, a lot of waking up as to the way that the world and our own government actually operates. And then of course, just, some hard experience from the last 3.5 years. And my understanding of 1984, just to use that example, because of all 6 of these, that's the one that I first came in contact with, and that was 20 years ago. My understanding is just so much deeper than it was then. So, okay. So I hope for some of you that answered some questions about the course. There's still plenty of time for you to sign up. Don't be intimidated by the reading. And if you're worried about, hey, I might miss some lessons, no big deal, because they'll all be recorded and you can easily catch up. All right. So thanks for joining me for this riveting discussion tonight.